She was abandoned, but he gave her a home. The cardboard box was soaked through from the December rain, but what broke David's heart wasn't the cold. It was the tiny fist that reached toward him, fingers curled around hope he didn't know he still had. The cardboard box was soaked through from the December rain, but what broke David's heart wasn't the cold. It was the tiny fist that reached toward him, fingers curled around hope he didn't know he still had. But let's start at the beginning, 3 hours before David Chen's world tilted on its axis. The law firm of Chen and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower that pierced Seattle's gray sky like a needle through fabric. David sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing contracts with the mechanical precision of a man who'd built his life on predictable outcomes. At 38, he'd mastered the art of existing without truly living, a skill that had served him well since Rebecca left 3 years ago, taking with her not just his marriage, but his dreams of the family they'd planned. "Mr. Chen." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your brother called again. About Christmas dinner." David's jaw tightened. "Tell him I'm working." "I already did. He said to tell you that Mom's making your favorite dumplings." The mention of his mother's cooking sent an unexpected pang through his chest. He'd spent the last 3 Christmases alone, claiming work obligations while his family gathered around tables laden with laughter and love he couldn't bear to witness. Their joy felt like a spotlight on his emptiness. "I'll call him back," David lied, already knowing he wouldn't. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop a tiny percussion in the symphony of his solitude. He'd chosen this life, the long hours, the empty apartment, the carefully constructed walls that kept him safe from the kind of vulnerability that had once left him shattered. It was a good life, he told himself. Successful. Controlled. Predictable. If only predictable didn't feel so much like dying. Meanwhile, across the city, in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and desperation, 17-year-old Lucia Martinez clutched her newborn daughter to her chest with trembling hands. The baby's cries were soft, almost apologetic, as if she already sensed the chaos into which she'd been born. "I can't," Lucia whispered to the social worker who sat beside her bed, her voice raw from 14 hours of labor and a lifetime of disappointment. "I can't give her what she needs." The social worker, a kind woman named Janet with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much, leaned forward. "Lucia, there are other options. Adoption agencies, foster families who—" "No." Lucia's voice cracked. "No agencies. No files. No people who might change their minds when she's not perfect anymore." She looked down at her daughter's face, memorizing features she'd never see again. "She deserves better than the system. She deserves a miracle." The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Lucia's thumb, and something inside the young mother broke completely. She'd grown up in foster care herself, bouncing between families who saw her as a monthly check rather than a child worth loving. She wouldn't condemn her daughter to the same fate. But what choice did she have? At 17, homeless and alone, with no family to help and no resources to provide, love felt like the cruelest gift she could offer. "I need some air," Lucia said, her voice barely audible. Janet hesitated. "The baby. We'll be safe. I need to think." What happened next would haunt Lucia for the rest of her life, but in that moment, desperate and broken, she saw only one path forward. She wrapped her daughter in the hospital blanket, soft and yellow, the color of sunshine she prayed the baby would find, and placed her in the cardboard box that had held her few possessions. The note she tucked beside the baby was written in shaking handwriting. "Her name is Sophie. She was born December 15th at 3:47 a.m. She weighs 6 pounds, 4 ounces. She's perfect. Please love her the way I can't." Lucia's hands shook as she carried the box through the hospital corridors, past nurses too busy to notice another teenager with a package. The service elevator carried her down to the parking garage, where rain fell in sheets against the concrete. She'd chosen this spot carefully, outside the law firm where she'd once cleaned offices, where she'd seen lawyers in expensive suits rushing past with important lives and important problems. People with resources. People who could give Sophie everything Lucia couldn't. The box felt impossibly heavy as she placed it near the entrance, sheltered by an overhang but visible to anyone leaving the building. She kissed her fingertips and pressed them to the cardboard, whispering a prayer in Spanish her grandmother had taught her years ago. Then she walked away, each step breaking another piece of her heart, knowing that sometimes the most profound act of love is letting go. David left the office at 11:47 p.m., later than usual, but not unusually late. The parking garage was nearly empty, his footsteps echoing off concrete walls as he made his way to his BMW. He was thinking about the Morrison case, about depositions and deadlines, about anything except the empty apartment waiting for him. The sound stopped him cold. A cry. Soft, urgent, unmistakably human. He paused, keys halfway to the ignition, and listened. There it was again, a baby's cry, thin and desperate in the underground gloom. David's heart began to race. He followed the sound, his Italian leather shoes clicking against wet concrete, until he reached the entrance area. That's when he saw it, a cardboard box, soggy from the rain that had blown in, with something moving inside. "Jesus," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside the box. The baby was tiny, wrapped in a yellow hospital blanket that had once been soft but was now damp and clinging. Her face was red from crying, her fists waving in the air like she was fighting an invisible enemy. When she saw David's face appear above her, she went silent, dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his chest tight. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Hey, sweetheart. What are you doing out here?" He looked around the empty garage, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might explain this impossible situation. But there was only rain, concrete, and a baby who couldn't be more than a few hours old. David's hands shook as he reached for the note tucked beside her. The words blurred as he read them, his throat closing around emotions he hadn't felt in years. Sophie. The name suited her somehow. She'd stopped crying entirely now, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so new to the world. Her tiny fist found his finger, wrapping around it with surprising strength. "Okay," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, Sophie himself, or the universe that had just turned his carefully ordered world upside down. "Okay, we're going to figure this out." He lifted the box carefully, Sophie's weight barely registering, but the responsibility of her pressing against his chest like a stone. As he carried her toward his car, calling 911 with his free hand, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose. The hospital lobby was a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. David clutched Sophie's hospital blanket, the only thing they'd let him keep, as nurses whisked her away for examinations. The social worker who appeared seemed kind but overwhelmed, her clipboard thick with forms and her eyes heavy with the weight of too many cases. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you some questions about how you found the baby." David answered mechanically, his mind replaying the moment he'd first seen Sophie's face. Something had shifted in that parking garage, something fundamental and irreversible. He'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart, but one look at that tiny, abandoned girl had cracked them wide open. "What happens to her now?" he asked when the questions stopped. "She'll be placed in emergency foster care while we investigate. If no family comes forward, she'll enter the system." The system. The words hit David like a physical blow. He thought about Sophie's dark eyes, the way she'd stopped crying when she saw his face, the trust in her tiny grip on his finger. What if? David's voice caught. What if someone wanted to foster her? Someone who was there when she was found? The social worker looked up from her clipboard, studying David with new interest. "That's unusual. The process typically involves background checks, home studies, training classes. It takes months. How long does she have? Before she's placed? Maybe a week. Emergency foster families are in short supply, especially for newborns. A week. 7 days for Sophie to disappear into a system that might never give her the love she deserved." David thought about his empty apartment, his hollow routine, the family dinners he'd avoided because other people's happiness felt like a mockery of his loneliness. Maybe this was why he'd been so empty. Maybe he'd been waiting for Sophie without even knowing it. "I want to apply," he said, his voice steady for the first time in hours. "I want to foster her." The social worker's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Chen, this is a big decision. You don't need to." "I'm not being impulsive," David interrupted, though part of him wondered if that was exactly what he was being. "I found her. I held her. I looked into her eyes and I saw." He paused, struggling to find words for something that transcended language. I saw home. The emergency foster care approval process that should have taken weeks compressed into 72 hours of David's life disappearing into paperwork, interviews, and sleepless nights. But none of that mattered the moment they placed Sophie back in his arms. She was so small. 3 days old, and already she'd been abandoned, processed, examined, and shuffled between strangers. Yet when David cradled her against his chest in the hospital room, she settled immediately, her tiny fist finding the fabric of his shirt and holding on like she'd been waiting for him. "She remembers you," said Janet, the social worker who'd been assigned to their case. "Babies bond quickly to consistent caregivers. The fact that you were the one who found her, it matters." David couldn't speak. He was too busy staring at Sophie's perfect features, the curve of her cheek, the dark fringe of her eyelashes, the way her lips moved in her sleep as if she were having conversations with angels. She was wearing a tiny pink onesie donated by the hospital, and someone had put a small knitted hat on her head that made her look impossibly fragile and impossibly strong at the same time. "Mr. Chen." Janet's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you ready to take her home?" Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue. His apartment had been many things: a refuge, a sanctuary, a carefully controlled environment where he could exist without truly living. But home, that implied something warmer, something alive. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "We're ready." The drive from the hospital to his downtown apartment was the most terrifying 20 minutes of David's life. Sophie slept in the car seat the hospital had provided, her breathing so soft he found himself pulling over twice just to make sure she was still alive. Every traffic light felt like a threat, every other driver a potential disaster waiting to happen. He'd never been responsible for anything so precious, so breakable. His apartment building's doorman, George, did a double-take when David walked through the lobby carrying a car seat. "Mr. Chen? Is that?" "This is Sophie," David said, surprised by how natural the introduction felt. "She's going to be staying with me for a while." George's weathered face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Little thing, isn't she? You need help with anything. My wife raised 4 kids. She knows about babies." "Thank you," David said, meaning it. "I might take you up on that." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt endless. Sophie stirred as they rose, making soft noises that weren't quite cries but weren't quite contentment either. David found himself humming, something he hadn't done in years, and she seemed to settle at the sound of his voice. His apartment looked different somehow. The sleek furniture and minimalist decor that had once felt sophisticated now seemed cold and unwelcoming. "How did you bring a baby into a space that had been designed to keep the world at arm's length?" "Okay, sweetheart," he whispered, lifting Sophie from her car seat. "Welcome home." She opened her eyes at the sound of his voice, those dark depths that seemed to see straight through to his soul. For a moment, they just looked at each other. This man who'd forgotten how to hope, and this baby who was hope incarnate. Then she yawned, a tiny sound that made David's heart clench with something that felt dangerously close to love. The first 24 hours were a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion David had never experienced. Sophie slept in 2-hour increments, which meant David slept in 90-minute stretches, setting alarms to wake himself for feedings even when she wasn't crying. He called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. "David." His assistant's voice was concerned. "Are you okay? You never get sick." "I'm fine," he said, watching Sophie sleep in the makeshift crib he'd created from a dresser drawer lined with soft blankets. "I just need a few days to adjust to something." "Adjust to what?" David looked at Sophie, at the way her tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, at the way her fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. "Everything," he said softly. "I need to adjust to everything." His brother Michael called that evening, just as David was attempting to give Sophie her first real bath in his kitchen sink. "David, Mom's worried about you. You missed family dinner again, and your assistant said you're sick. What's going on?" David held the phone between his shoulder and ear, his hands supporting Sophie in the warm water. She seemed to like the bath, her fists moving in slow motion through the water, her eyes wide with wonder. "I'm not sick," David said. I have a baby." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. "You have a what now?" "A baby. Her name is Sophie. She was abandoned, and I found her, and now I'm fostering her." "You're fostering a baby." Michael's voice was carefully neutral. "David, what the hell is going on? 3 days ago you were canceling Christmas dinner, and now you're a foster parent." David lifted Sophie from the water, wrapping her in a soft towel. She looked up at him with those trusting eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he'd thought was sealed forever. "I know how it sounds," he said. "But Michael, when I found her, when I held her for the first time, it was like something inside me that had been broken suddenly made sense again. David, I know I'm not ready. I know I don't have experience. But she needs me, and I think I need her too." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "What can I do to help?" The question hit David like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd let anyone help him with anything? When was the last time he'd admitted to needing help? "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what I'm doing." "None of us do," Michael said gently. "That's what makes us human. Bring her to dinner on Sunday. Let Mom and Dad meet her. Let us help you figure this out." After he hung up, David sat in his kitchen holding Sophie, both of them wrapped in the quiet of his apartment. The city lights twinkled beyond his windows, but for the first time in years, he wasn't looking outward. He was looking down at the baby in his arms, at the way she'd changed everything simply by existing. "What do you think, sweetheart?" he whispered. "Ready to meet your family?" Sophie made a soft sound that might have been agreement, or might have been gas, but David chose to interpret it as approval. The next morning brought Janet for the first home visit. David had been up since 4 a.m., cleaning his apartment and trying to make it look more suitable for a baby. He'd moved the sharp corners of his coffee table, bought outlet covers, and attempted to create a nursery in his spare bedroom using furniture ordered online and assembled in a panic. "Mr. Chen," Janet said, looking around the apartment with professional eyes. "This is impressive. Most emergency foster placements don't have this level of preparation." "I want to do right by her," David said, watching Sophie sleep in the proper crib that had been delivered the night before. "She's been through enough." Janet made notes on her clipboard. "How are you managing?" "The sleep deprivation, the schedule changes." "I'm managing," David said, though the exhaustion was like a weight on his shoulders. "It's worth it. And work. I'm taking some time off. I have good people who can handle things." Janet looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "Most people struggle with the adjustment. You seem to be adapting well." David thought about that. Was he adapting? Or was he simply becoming who he was supposed to be? "She makes it easy," he said. "When I hold her, when she looks at me, it's like she knows something I'm still learning." "What's that?" David was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophie's chest rise and fall. "That love doesn't have to be earned. Sometimes it's just chosen." That afternoon, David took Sophie for her first walk in the stroller he'd bought online. Seattle's December air was crisp and clean, and Sophie seemed fascinated by the world beyond his apartment windows. She stayed awake for the entire walk, her dark eyes taking in everything: the trees, the buildings, the people who stopped to peer into her stroller and comment on how beautiful she was. "She's gorgeous," said an elderly woman walking her dog. "How old is she?" 5 days, David said, still amazed by the fact that he could answer that question. 5 days. My goodness, she's alert for such a little one. She knows her daddy, doesn't she? Daddy. The word hit David like a physical blow. He wasn't Sophie's father. He was her foster parent, her temporary guardian, the man who'd happened to find her when she needed finding. But when the woman said it, when she looked at them together and saw a family— "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "She knows me." Walking back to his apartment, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. He felt like he was coming home rather than returning to a place where he happened to live. Sophie had been with him for less than a week, but already she'd transformed his space into something that felt alive, something that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "Mom wants to know if Sophie needs anything. She's been shopping for baby clothes all morning." David smiled, imagining his mother in the baby section of a department store, overwhelmed by tiny socks and soft blankets. His family had always been close, but he'd held them at arm's length since Rebecca left. afraid that their love would highlight the emptiness in his own life. Now, with Sophie sleeping in his arms, that emptiness felt like preparation rather than loss. Like he'd been waiting for her without knowing it. "What do you think?" he whispered to Sophie as they entered his apartment building. "Ready to let some more people love you?" She stirred at the sound of his voice, her tiny fist finding his finger and holding on. David took that as a yes. Sometimes the most life-changing moments come disguised as the scariest ones. When have you said yes to something that terrified you but felt completely right? Share your story. I think we all need to hear about courage that looks like love. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after David had found Sophie. He was feeding her on his living room couch, marveling at how she seemed to grow stronger each day, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Chen? This is Detective Rivera with Seattle PD. I'm calling about the infant you found last week." David's blood turned to ice. Sophie continued drinking from her bottle, oblivious to the way his world had suddenly tilted. "What about her?" "We may have located the birth mother. I need you to bring the child to the station for questioning." The words hit David like physical blows. Birth mother. Bring the child. As if Sophie were evidence rather than the tiny person who'd been sleeping in his arms for 7 nights, who'd learned to recognize his voice, who'd made his apartment feel like home for the first time in his adult life. When? David's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "This afternoon, if possible. 2 o'clock. David looked down at Sophie, at the way she trusted him completely, at the way her tiny hand rested against his chest as she fed. The thought of handing her over to strangers, of watching her disappear into a system that saw her as a case number rather than a miracle, made his chest tight with panic. "Mr. Chen? Are you there?" "Yes," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be there." The drive to the police station felt like a funeral procession. Sophie slept in her car seat, peaceful and unaware that her world might be about to change again. David found himself memorizing everything about her. The way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the soft sound of her breathing, the way she seemed to smile in her sleep. What if this was the last time he held her? What if the birth mother had changed her mind? What if Sophie disappeared from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it? The police station was a maze of fluorescent lights and institutional beige. Detective Rivera was younger than David had expected, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that didn't quite hide the weight of the conversation they were about to have. "Mr. Chen, thank you for coming in. This is social worker Janet Martinez. I believe you two have met." Janet nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "David, I know this is difficult, but we need to talk about Sophie's situation." They sat in a conference room that smelled of coffee and anxiety. Sophie woke up as they settled into chairs, her dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings before finding David's face. She relaxed immediately, her tiny fist wrapping around his finger. "We've been in contact with a young woman named Lucia Martinez," Detective Rivera began. "She came forward after seeing news coverage of the abandoned infant. She claims to be the birth mother." David's heart hammered against his ribs. "Claims. DNA testing will confirm it, but the details she's provided match the circumstances of the abandonment. She says she left the baby outside your building because she couldn't provide for her. And now," David's voice was hoarse. Janet leaned forward. "Now she's asking for her daughter back." The words hit David like a physical blow. He looked down at Sophie, at the way she watched him with complete trust, at the way she'd fit so perfectly into his life that he couldn't imagine existing without her. "She abandoned her," David said, his voice sharper than he intended. "She left her in a box in the rain." "Mr. Chen," Detective Rivera said gently, "I understand you've bonded with the infant. But if this young woman is the birth mother, she has legal rights. What about Sophie's rights?" David's voice cracked. "What about her right to stability, to someone who won't abandon her when things get difficult?" Janet's expression softened. "David, I know this is hard, but we have to consider all possibilities. The birth mother is very young, 17. She may have been in crisis when she made the decision to abandon the baby. And what happens when she's in crisis again?" The question hung in the air like smoke. David looked at Sophie, at the way she'd started to fuss, sensing the tension in the room. He lifted her to his shoulder, and she settled immediately, her tiny body molding to his. "I want to meet her," David said suddenly. "The birth mother. I want to talk to her." Detective Rivera and Janet exchanged glances. "That's unusual," Janet said. "In most cases, we try to maintain separation between." "This isn't most cases," David interrupted. "This is Sophie. This is about what's best for her, not what's easiest for the system." An hour later, David found himself in another conference room, this one smaller and somehow more oppressive. Sophie slept in her car seat beside him, her breathing the only sound in the heavy silence. When the door opened, David's first thought was how young Lucia Martinez looked. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that held too much pain for someone who should still be worried about high school graduation. She stopped when she saw Sophie, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. "She's so much bigger already." David watched Lucia's face, saw the love and anguish warring in her expression. This wasn't a careless teenager who'd made a mistake. This was a young woman who'd made an impossible choice and was living with the consequences. "Her name is Sophie," David said quietly. Lucia's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I named her that. It means wisdom." She looked at David, studying his face. "You're the one who found her." "Yes. Is she happy? Is she healthy?" David's throat tightened. "She's perfect. She's smart and alert, and she's changed my life." Lucia sat down across from him, her hands shaking. "I didn't want to abandon her. I need you to know that. I love her more than anything in this world." "Then why?" The question came out harsher than David intended. Lucia's face crumpled. "Because love isn't enough. I'm 17 years old. I have no family, no money, no place to live. I've been in foster care since I was 8, and I know what that system does to kids. I couldn't condemn her to that. So you left her in a box. I left her where someone with resources would find her. Someone who could give her what I couldn't." Lucia looked at Sophie, then back at David. "Someone like you." David felt something shift in his chest. "Then why are you here? Why do you want her back?" Lucia was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've gotten help. Social services found me a place in a group home for teen mothers. They have programs, resources. I thought maybe I could try to be what she needs. And if you can't?" The question hung between them like a blade. Lucia's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Then I'll have failed her twice." David looked at Sophie, sleeping peacefully in her car seat, unaware that her future was being decided by 2 people who loved her in completely different ways. He thought about the past week, about the way she'd fit into his life like a missing piece, about the way she'd made him feel human again. "She knows me," he said quietly. "She recognizes my voice, my heartbeat. She stops crying when I hold her." "I know." Lucia's voice was barely a whisper. "I can see it. The way she looks at you, it's the way a daughter looks at her father." The words hit David like a physical blow. "Lucia, I made a decision when I left her," Lucia continued, her voice growing stronger. "I chose her happiness over my own. I chose her future over my pain. And looking at you 2 together, I think I chose right." David stared at her, not daring to hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the best thing I can do for Sophie is to let her stay with the man who's already her father in every way that matters." Lucia reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of Sophie's car seat. "I'm saying that maybe love means letting go twice." The silence in the room was deafening. David felt tears running down his cheeks, tears he hadn't realized he was crying. Sophie stirred in her sleep, her tiny fist opening and closing as if she were reaching for something. "I need to know she'll be loved," Lucia said. "I need to know she'll be safe and happy, and that she'll grow up knowing she was wanted." "She will be," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She already is." Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Then I want to sign whatever papers I need to sign. I want to make this official. I want to make sure no one can ever take her away from you." Detective Rivera, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat. "Ms. Martinez, this is a big decision. You don't have to make it today. You can take time to think." "I've been thinking for 8 days," Lucia interrupted. 8 days of wondering if I made the right choice, if she's okay, if she's loved. And now I know. She is." She stood up, her small frame somehow seeming stronger than when she'd entered the room. I need to sign papers to terminate my parental rights. I need to make sure Mr. Chen can adopt her properly. I need to make sure she's protected. David stood too, still holding Sophie. Lucia, will you tell her about me someday? Lucia asked. Will you tell her that I loved her enough to let her go? I'll tell her every day, David promised. I'll tell her about the young woman who was brave enough to choose love over fear, who gave her the greatest gift possible, a chance at the life she deserved. Lucia smiled through her tears. Thank you for finding her, for loving her, for being the father she needed. As she turned to leave, David called after her. Lucia, you'll always be part of her story. You'll always be the reason she came home. Lucia paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Take care of her, Mr. Chen. Take care of my little girl. And then she was gone, leaving David alone with Sophie and the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. He looked down at the baby in his arms, at the way she'd slept peacefully through the conversation that had determined her entire future. Well, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Looks like we're going to be okay after all. But even as he said it, David knew the real challenges were just beginning. The legal process of adoption would take months. There would be home studies, evaluations, background checks. There would be nights when he doubted himself, moments when he wondered if he was enough. And somewhere in the future, there would be conversations with Sophie about where she came from, about the young woman who'd loved her enough to let her go, about the complex nature of family and love and sacrifice. But for now, in this moment, David held his daughter close and let himself believe that love really was enough. That sometimes the most broken people could create the most beautiful families. That sometimes the most unexpected gifts came wrapped in the most challenging packages. Sophie stirred in his arms, her dark eyes opening to find his face. She made a soft sound, not quite a cry, not quite a coo, and David felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. I love you too, sweetheart, he whispered. I love you too. The hardest decisions often involve loving someone enough to let them go, or loving them enough to fight for them. Have you ever had to choose between what your heart wanted and what you believed was right? Share your story. Sometimes the most difficult choices reveal the most about who we are. The legal machinery of adoption moved with glacial slowness, but life with Sophie accelerated at breakneck speed. 3 weeks after Lucia's decision to terminate her parental rights, David found himself navigating a world he'd never imagined. One filled with pediatrician appointments, social worker visits, and the constant, overwhelming responsibility of keeping another human being alive and thriving. The forced proximity wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, a complete reorganization of everything he thought he knew about himself. Mr. Chen, said Dr. Sarah Kim, Sophie's pediatrician, as she finished examining the baby on the examination table. She's gaining weight beautifully. Her development is right on track. How are you managing? David looked down at Sophie, who was staring up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. At 6 weeks old, she was becoming more alert, more interactive, more undeniably herself with each passing day. Some days I feel like I'm drowning, he admitted. Other days I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Dr. Kim smiled. That sounds like new parenthood to me. The fact that you're questioning yourself is actually a good sign. It means you care. Caring was an understatement. David had discovered that loving Sophie was like breathing, necessary, automatic, and absolutely essential to his survival. He'd also discovered that the intensity of that love was terrifying in ways he'd never anticipated. What if he made the wrong decision? What if he wasn't enough? What if something happened to her while she was in his care? The questions followed him through sleepless nights and exhausting days, a constant undercurrent of anxiety that he was learning to live with. But they were balanced by moments of pure joy. Sophie's first real smile, the way she'd learned to recognize his voice, the way she'd grab his finger with surprising strength and hold on like she never wanted to let go. There's something else we need to discuss, Dr. Kim said, her tone growing more serious. Sophie's adoption caseworker called. There's been a development. David's blood turned to ice. What kind of development? Lucia Martinez has been admitted to the psychiatric unit at Harborview. Apparently, she's been struggling with postpartum depression and has had some concerning thoughts. The words hit David like a physical blow. He thought about Lucia's face the day she'd signed the papers, the way she'd looked at Sophie with such love and such pain. He'd been so focused on his own relief at being able to keep Sophie that he hadn't fully considered what Lucia might be going through. Is she okay? She's getting the help she needs. But her hospitalization raises some questions about her mental state when she made the decision to terminate her rights. There might be legal challenges. David felt the ground shift beneath his feet. What does that mean for Sophie? It means we wait. It means we hope. And it means you need to be prepared for the possibility that this process might take longer than expected. Driving home from the pediatrician's office, David found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Sophie slept peacefully in her car seat, unaware that her future was once again uncertain. He thought about Lucia, alone in a hospital room, fighting demons he couldn't imagine. He thought about Sophie, growing stronger and more attached to him every day. He thought about the legal system that would ultimately decide whether they got to stay together. And he thought about the terrifying possibility that he might lose her. That evening, David's apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in. He'd arranged his schedule so he could work from home most days, but the constant presence of Sophie's needs, feeding, changing, soothing, playing, left little room for the kind of focused concentration his legal practice required. His brother Michael had been stopping by regularly, bringing groceries and staying to help with whatever David needed. Tonight, he arrived with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant and a bag of baby supplies their mother had sent. "You look like hell," Michael said, studying David's face as he set the food on the kitchen counter. "Thanks for the pep talk," David replied, but without real irritation. He was holding Sophie, who was having one of her fussy periods, not quite crying, but not quite settled either. "I'm serious. When was the last time you slept for more than 2 hours at a time?" David thought about it. "I don't remember." "And when was the last time you left this apartment for something other than a doctor's appointment or a social worker visit?" Again, David couldn't remember. The world had narrowed to the boundaries of his apartment, to the rhythm of Sophie's needs, to the constant vigilance required to keep her safe and happy. "This isn't sustainable," Michael said gently. "You're burning out, and that's not good for either of you." "I'm fine," David insisted, though he could hear the exhaustion in his own voice. "You're not fine. You're surviving, but you're not thriving. And Sophie needs you to thrive." As if summoned by the sound of her name, Sophie let out a wail that seemed to come from the depths of her tiny soul. David began the familiar routine, checking her diaper, offering a bottle, trying different positions to soothe her. Nothing worked. "Here," Michael said, extending his arms. "Let me try." David's first instinct was to refuse. He'd become fiercely protective of Sophie, reluctant to let anyone else hold her for extended periods. But the desperation in Sophie's cries and the exhaustion in his own body made the decision for him. He handed Sophie to Michael, who immediately began walking around the apartment in a swaying motion that David had never tried. Within minutes, Sophie's cries had faded to whimpers, then to silence. "How did you do that?" David asked, amazed. "Practice," Michael said. "Remember, I have 3 kids. Sometimes they just need a different energy, a different rhythm." David sank into his couch, feeling the weight of fatigue settle into his bones. "I'm terrified I'm going to mess this up." "You're not going to mess it up. You don't know that. What if I'm not enough? What if she needs more than I can give her?" Michael sat down beside him, still holding Sophie, who was now sleeping peacefully. "David, do you remember when Rebecca left?" David's jaw tightened. "What does that have to do with anything? You disappeared for 6 months. You threw yourself into work. You stopped returning calls. You basically went into hibernation. We were worried about you. I was fine. You were surviving. Just like you're surviving now. But there's a difference between surviving and living, and Sophie needs you to live." David looked at his daughter, and that's what she was, he realized, regardless of biology or legal documents. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. "What if I lose her?" The words came out as a whisper. "What if you don't?" The simple question hung in the air between them. David had spent so much energy preparing for loss that he'd forgotten to prepare for permanence. "The lawyer called today," David said. "There might be legal challenges because of Lucia's hospitalization. Michael nodded. I figured it was something like that. You've been wound tighter than usual. I can't lose her, Michael. I know that makes me selfish, but I can't. She's not just my daughter, she's my purpose. She's the reason I get up in the morning, the reason I come home at night. She's the reason I feel human again. Then fight for her. I am fighting for her. No, you're defending against losing her. There's a difference. Michael shifted Sophie to his other arm. Fighting for her means building a life that's so stable, so full of love, that no court in the world would even consider taking her away from you. David thought about that. He'd spent the past 6 weeks in survival mode, reacting to each crisis as it arose. But maybe it was time to stop reacting and start building. What does that look like? He asked. It looks like accepting help when it's offered. It looks like building a support system. It looks like making sure you're not just Sophie's caretaker, but her father in every sense of the word. That night, after Michael had left, David sat in his living room holding Sophie and thinking about the conversation. His brother was right. He'd been so focused on not losing her that he'd forgotten to build the kind of life that would make losing her impossible. He thought about the pediatrician visits, the social worker meetings, the constant anxiety about doing everything perfectly. He thought about the way he'd isolated himself, afraid to let anyone else into their little bubble of two. But Sophie needed more than just his love. She needed stability, community, the kind of family that extended beyond biology to include the people who chose to love her. What do you think, sweetheart? He whispered to Sophie, who was sleeping in his arms. Ready to let some more people love you? As if in response, Sophie's tiny fist wrapped around his finger, holding on with the kind of trust that made David's chest tight with emotion. He thought about his parents, who'd been begging to meet their new granddaughter. He thought about his co-workers, who'd been covering for him without complaint. He thought about his neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who'd been leaving casseroles outside his door with notes about how excited she was to meet the baby. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of needing people. Maybe it was time to start building the kind of life that would make Sophie's place in it unshakable. The next morning, David made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. He called his mother. Mom, it's David. I was wondering, would you like to come over and meet Sophie? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. David. His mother's voice was thick with emotion. Are you sure? I'm sure. We need you, Mom. Both of us. I'll be there in 20 minutes. David smiled, looking down at Sophie, who was awake and alert in his arms. Hear that, sweetheart? You're about to meet your grandmother. Sophie made a soft sound that might have been excitement, or might have been gas, but David chose to interpret it as approval. For the first time in 6 weeks, David felt something besides anxiety about the future. He felt hope. The social worker's file felt impossibly heavy in David's hands as Sophie napped in her crib, 18 months old now, and no longer the fragile infant he'd found that December night. The manila folder contained everything and nothing, clinical notes that reduced a human tragedy to bullet points and timestamps. Birth mother, Maria Santos, 17 years old. Homeless. Father of child unknown. David closed his eyes, remembering his own 17-year-old self. Worried about college applications and weekend plans, not where his next meal would come from or how to care for a baby when he was barely more than a child himself. The report detailed Maria's final weeks of pregnancy, how she'd lived in a shelter until they discovered her drug use, how she'd disappeared 3 days before giving birth only to resurface at the hospital in active labor. She'd held Sophie for exactly 47 minutes after delivery. The nurses had noted the time before asking them to take her away. She kept saying, I can't, I can't, I can't, the hospital notes read. Patient appeared to be in significant emotional distress. Refused to name father. Signed relinquishment papers and left AMA at 3:47 a.m. David's chest tightened. He'd been so angry at first. How could anyone abandon a baby? But now, staring at the sparse details of Maria's life, he felt something else entirely. She'd been a child herself, scared and alone, making an impossible choice with no good options. He set the file aside and walked to the window, watching the evening light fade over the city. In the reflection, he could see Sophie's crib, could hear her soft breathing. For 18 months, he'd been her whole world, and she'd become his. But tonight, for the first time, he truly understood the weight of what Maria had given up, and what she'd given him. The second file was thicker, his own psychiatric evaluation from 3 years ago, when everything had fallen apart. Dr. Winters had been thorough, documenting every detail of the breakdown that had cost him his marriage, nearly his career, and almost his life. Patient exhibits signs of complicated grief following infant loss. Wife miscarried at 24 weeks gestation. Patient reports feeling responsible and broken. Relationship with spouse deteriorated rapidly post-loss. Patient withdrew from social connections and threw himself into work as avoidance mechanism. David remembered those sessions, how Dr. Winters had pushed him to confront the emptiness that had opened up inside him when they lost baby James. How he'd built walls so high around his heart that even Claire couldn't reach him anymore. She'd tried, but he'd been drowning in his own grief, unable to see her pain alongside his own. "I keep thinking about the nursery," he'd told Dr. Winters. "We painted it yellow because we wanted to be surprised. Claire picked out this mobile with little elephants. After we lost him, I couldn't even walk past that room. I moved out of the house rather than deal with it." The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd been so terrified of loving and losing again that he'd chosen to lose everything preemptively. The divorce papers had arrived 6 months later, along with Claire's tear-stained letter explaining that she couldn't grieve alone anymore. But Sophie had changed everything. That first night, when he'd held her tiny body against his chest in the hospital, something had cracked open inside him. Not the breaking kind of crack, but the kind that lets light in. She'd needed him in a way that was immediate and uncomplicated. She didn't care about his past failures or his fear of loving too much. She just needed him to show up. And he had. David picked up the third file, the private investigator's report he'd commissioned last month. He'd told himself he needed to know more about Sophie's background for medical reasons, but the truth was messier than that. He needed to understand Maria's story, to make sense of the choice that had brought Sophie into his life. Maria Santos, age 19 now, currently enrolled in community college nursing program, clean for 8 months, living in transitional housing, employed part-time at medical clinic. The photographs were grainy but clear enough, a young woman with Sophie's dark eyes and delicate features, walking to class with textbooks under her arm. She looked tired but determined, older than her years but somehow still achingly young. The investigator had been thorough. Maria had gotten clean 4 months after abandoning Sophie, had been in and out of rehab twice before it stuck. She'd aged out of the foster system at 18 with nothing but a GED and a determination to become a nurse. She was working her way through school, taking prerequisite classes while living in a halfway house for women in recovery. Subject was observed visiting St. Mary's Cemetery monthly. Brings flowers to unmarked section where abandoned infants are buried. Appears to be grieving ritual. David's hands trembled as he read that line. Maria thought Sophie was dead. She'd been mourning her daughter for over a year, never knowing that Sophie was thriving, loved, celebrated every day of her life. The weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a physical thing. He held the power to reunite a mother with her child, to heal a wound that had been festering for 18 months. But doing so would mean risking everything: his relationship with Sophie, the family they'd built, the life they'd created together. Sophie stirred in her crib, making the soft mewling sounds that meant she was waking up. David closed the files and went to her, lifting her warm, sleepy body into his arms. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Did you have a good nap?" She blinked up at him with those dark eyes, Maria's eyes, and smiled, her chubby hands reaching for his face. In that moment, David understood something fundamental about love. It wasn't about ownership or keeping what was yours. It was about doing what was best for the person you loved, even when it threatened to destroy you. He thought about Maria, 19 years old and studying to be a nurse, trying to build a life worth living while grieving the daughter she'd never forgotten. He thought about Sophie, who deserved to know her story, to understand where she came from and why she'd been placed in that cardboard box on a December night. And he thought about himself, the man who'd found love again in the most unexpected place, who'd discovered that the heart he'd thought was broken beyond repair was actually just waiting for the right person to help him heal. The choice ahead of him wasn't between keeping Sophie and losing her. It was between fear and courage, between holding tight and letting love expand to include all the broken, beautiful people who had brought them together. As Sophie babbled contentedly in his arms, David made a decision that would change everything. He picked up his phone and dialed the number he'd memorized from the investigator's report. It was time to call Maria. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It crept in through quiet moments. The way Sophie's breathing deepened when David hummed absent-mindedly while making her bottle, or how her tiny fingers would curl around his thumb during 3 a.m. feedings, as if anchoring herself to something solid in a world that had already proven unreliable. David had stopped calling it temporary custody somewhere around the 3rd week. The words felt hollow now, like calling a sunrise just another Tuesday. He'd reorganized his entire life around her schedule without realizing it. Conference calls moved to nap time, business dinners canceled in favor of bath time, his pristine home office converted into a nursery that somehow felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. "She's got your stubborn streak," Margaret, his housekeeper, observed one morning as Sophie refused her bottle, turning her head away with the determination of someone who knew exactly what she wanted, even at 6 months old. "She's not mine," David replied automatically, but the words caught in his throat. Sophie chose that moment to look directly at him, her dark eyes serious and studying, as if she could see straight through the walls he'd built around his heart. Then she smiled, not the reflexive grin of a baby responding to a face, but something deeper, more knowing. A smile that said, "I see you, and I choose you too." The bottle was forgotten as David lifted her from the high chair, spinning her gently until she giggled. The sound like music in a house that had been silent for too long. When he stopped, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart, and babbled something that sounded suspiciously like "Dada." "She didn't mean," David started, but Margaret's knowing look silenced him. "Babies don't lie about love," she said simply, gathering the dishes. "They just know." That night, David sat in the rocking chair beside Sophie's crib, watching her sleep. She'd refused to settle until he'd read her 3 stories, sung 2 lullabies, and promised to stay until she fell asleep. Now she lay on her back, one arm thrown above her head in complete trust, her breathing soft and even. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago. Successful, controlled, predictable. That man had measured his worth in profit margins and quarterly reports. This man measured it in the weight of a sleeping child, in the trust of someone who had every reason not to trust, in the way she reached for him first when she woke from nightmares that babies shouldn't have to dream. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered to the darkness, his voice barely audible above the soft whir of the nightlight. "But I know I can't lose you." As if sensing his words, Sophie stirred, her little hand finding the edge of her blanket and pulling it close. In her sleep, she sighed, a sound of complete contentment that made David's chest tight with an emotion he was finally brave enough to name. Love. Not the careful, measured affection he'd rationed out in his previous relationships, but something fierce and unconditional and absolutely terrifying. The kind of love that changed everything, that made you willing to fight dragons and move mountains and stay up all night just to make sure someone else could sleep peacefully. The next morning brought new milestones. Sophie's first real word, it was "Dada," clear as day, spoken while pointing directly at David. Her first independent steps, taken in her determination to reach him from across the living room. Her first time feeding herself, resulting in more food on the floor than in her mouth, but accompanied by such proud babbling that David found himself taking pictures like a documentary filmmaker. "Look at that," he said, crouching down to her level as she toddled toward him, arms outstretched for balance. "Look at you, little warrior." Sophie's response was to collapse into his arms with a squeal of delight, sticky fingers tangling in his hair, leaving traces of banana and unconditional love on his expensive suit jacket. David held her close, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and something uniquely hers, sweetness and possibility and home. That evening, as he tucked her into bed, Sophie reached up and patted his cheek with the same gentle touch she'd seen him use with her scraped knees and hurt feelings. "Love you," she said, the words slightly slurred with sleep but unmistakably clear. David's throat constricted. He'd been waiting his whole life to hear those words and mean them back with every fiber of his being. I love you too, sweetheart. So much. Sophie smiled, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she was asleep, one hand curled around the edge of his sleeve, as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear while she dreamed. David sat there long after she'd settled, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, marveling at how completely she'd rewired his heart. He thought about the cardboard box, about the rain, about the moment when two broken souls had found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something beautiful together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She was walking now, which meant childproofing everything and chasing after a tiny person who viewed the world as her personal playground. There would be scraped knees and bedtime battles, and the inevitable questions about her beginning that would come as she grew older. But tonight, in the soft glow of the nightlight, David finally understood what he'd been missing all those years. Not just the love of a child, but the profound privilege of being chosen by someone who had no reason to trust, no obligation to love, no guarantees of forever, and who chose him anyway. He pressed a gentle kiss to Sophie's forehead, inhaling the sweet scent of her dreams. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, the words both promise and prayer. "We're going to be more than okay." In her sleep, Sophie's fingers tightened around his sleeve, as if she'd heard him and agreed. Outside, the world continued its restless turning, but inside this room, two hearts that had found each other in the cold and rain beat in perfect synchronization, creating something that had never existed before, a family, chosen and cherished and absolutely unbreakable. 15 years later, the house still held echoes of those early morning lullabies, but they were drowned out now by the slam of Sophie's bedroom door and the suffocating silence that followed. David stood in the hallway, his hand still raised from knocking, the adoption papers trembling slightly in his grip. Inside her room, he could hear the muffled sounds of Sophie crying. Not the innocent tears of the baby he'd once rocked to sleep, but the raw, broken sobs of a teenager who'd just learned that everything she thought she knew about herself was built on a foundation of lies. "Sophie, please," he called through the door. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the wood like a blade. "That you've been lying to me my entire life? That I'm not even your real daughter." The words hit him like physical blows. Not your real daughter. 15 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, piano recitals, and homework battles reduced to a technicality. The absence of shared DNA. It had started so innocently. Sophie's school project on family trees had sent her digging through old photo albums, asking questions about grandparents she'd never met, about baby pictures that seemed to begin at 6 months old. David had deflected for weeks, but Sophie had inherited his stubborn streak. The one Margaret had noticed all those years ago, and she'd kept pressing. The truth had finally come out in the worst possible way. Not through his careful explanation or a planned conversation, but through a shouting match with her best friend Emma, who'd thrown it in her face during a petty argument. "At least my parents actually wanted me. Everyone knows you were just some throwaway baby." David felt sorry for. The cruelty of teenage girls could be surgical in its precision. "Sophie, open the door." David's voice was steadier now, carrying the authority of a man who'd learned to navigate boardrooms and hostile takeovers. But this wasn't business. This was his daughter, and all his success meant nothing if he couldn't reach her. "Go away." The words were punctuated by something heavy hitting the door. Probably the snow globe from her dresser, the one they'd bought together at the Christmas market when she was 7. David pressed his forehead against the door, remembering that day. Sophie had been enchanted by the tiny scene inside the globe, shaking it over and over to watch the snow fall on the miniature village. "It's like a whole world in there," she'd whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Safe and perfect, and nothing bad can happen." He'd bought it for her on the spot, along with hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts, carrying her on his shoulders when she got tired. She'd called him Daddy for the first time that day, unself-consciously, as if she'd been saving the word for just the right moment. Now that world was shattered, the snow globe probably in pieces on her bedroom floor. "I know you're angry," David said, his voice softer now. "I know you feel betrayed. But Sophie, you have to understand." "Understand what?" The door flew open so suddenly that David stumbled backward. Sophie stood in the doorway, her dark hair wild, her face blotchy with tears. At 15, she was already beautiful in the way that would break hearts someday. Tall and graceful, with eyes that held depths of emotion that sometimes scared him with their intensity. Right now, those eyes were full of pain and fury. That you lied to me? That every time I asked about my mother, you changed the subject? That you let me believe I was chosen instead of telling me I was thrown away like garbage? You were chosen, David said firmly, taking a step toward her. Every single day, Sophie. Every single moment. That's never been a lie. She laughed, but it was bitter and hollow. By who? By the man who felt sorry for the pathetic abandoned baby? Or by the woman who couldn't even look at me long enough to give me a name? The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. David felt something crack inside his chest, not just hurt, but fear. The fear that had lived in the back of his mind for 15 years. The knowledge that someday she might look at him and see not a father, but a stranger who'd inserted himself into her life. Your mother was 17, he said quietly. She was scared and alone, and she thought she was giving you a chance at a better life. She didn't abandon you, Sophie. She made an impossible choice because she loved you. Don't. Sophie's voice was sharp. Don't you dare try to make this beautiful. She left me in a cardboard box in the rain. Like trash. Like something she couldn't wait to get rid of. And I found you, David said, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay strong. I found you, and you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. You were perfect and precious, Anne. And you felt sorry for me. Sophie's words were quiet now, which somehow made them more devastating than her shouting. That's what this is, isn't it? 15 years of pity. The successful businessman's charity case. That's not true, isn't it? She turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't good enough for her to keep. Now I know I wasn't good enough for you to tell me the truth either. David moved into her room, stepping carefully around the pieces of the broken snow globe. The tiny village lay scattered across the hardwood floor. The church steeple by her dresser, the little houses near the window, the plastic people frozen in their eternal winter wonderland, now separated and alone. Sophie, he said, and his voice carried 15 years of love and fear and desperate hope. Look at me. She turned reluctantly, her arms still wrapped around herself like armor. I have loved you every single day since the moment I found you. Not because I felt sorry for you, not because I needed a charity case, but because you were mine. You were mine from the second I saw you, and I was yours. That's not pity, sweetheart. That's love. But you're not my real father, she whispered, and there it was, the wound at the heart of everything, the fear that had been growing in the dark corners of her mind since she was old enough to understand what abandonment meant. I'm the man who taught you to ride a bike, David said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. I'm the man who held you when you had nightmares, who helped you with your homework, who cheered louder than anyone else at your piano recitals. I'm the man who loves you more than his own life. If that doesn't make me your real father, then I don't know what does. Sophie's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the lost 6-month-old baby he'd found in the rain. But what if you change your mind? What if you decide I'm too much trouble? What if you leave? And there it was, the truth beneath the anger, the fear that had been festering since she was old enough to understand that some people left and didn't come back. The primal wound that no amount of love could completely heal, the knowledge that she'd been left once and could be left again. David crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he had when she was small enough to fit against his chest. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered into her hair. I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. You're stuck with me, whether you like it or not. But even as he held her, even as her sobs gradually quieted and her breathing evened out, David knew that something had shifted between them. The absolute trust of childhood had been shattered along with the snow globe, replaced by something more complex and fragile. She was no longer the little girl who believed he could fix anything with a Band-Aid and a bedtime story. She was becoming a woman who would have to choose, every day, to trust in love that couldn't be proven by blood, only by the accumulation of moments, the daily choice to stay, the courage to believe that some people meant it when they said forever. As Sophie pulled away from him, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, David saw the challenge in her gaze. She was testing him now, waiting to see if he would prove her worst fears right or fight for the bond they'd built together. I need time to think, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. David nodded, though it killed him to step back, to give her space when every instinct screamed at him to hold on tighter. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the war being fought behind her eyes. The child who wanted to run into his arms, and the teenager who was learning that love was more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The papers, she said finally, nodding toward the adoption documents that lay scattered on the floor. Why didn't you ever make it legal? David's heart clenched. I kept meaning to, but every time I started the process, I convinced myself it didn't matter, that what we had was already real. I was afraid. He trailed off, not sure how to explain the complex tangle of emotions that had kept him from filing those papers year after year. Afraid of what? Afraid that making it legal would somehow make it less than what it was, that it would reduce our bond to something that needed a judge's approval. He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling every one of his 53 years. I was wrong. I should have given you that security. Sophie stared at the papers, her expression unreadable. Would you still want to? Even now? More than anything, David said without hesitation. If you'll have me. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 15 years of love and the sudden, terrifying awareness of how fragile it all was. Outside, the world continued its indifferent turning, but inside this room, two hearts that had found each other in the cold and rain hung, suspended in the space between the family they'd been and the family they might choose to become. Sophie bent down and picked up a piece of the broken snow globe. One of the tiny plastic people, a little girl in a red coat with her arms outstretched, as if she were running toward something wonderful. I loved this, she said quietly, holding the figure up to the light. I know. I remember the day we bought it. You carried me on your shoulders because my legs got tired. You were 7, and you'd eaten your weight in Christmas cookies. Despite everything, Sophie's mouth quirked up at the corner. I called you Daddy for the first time that day. I know. I went home and cried because I was so happy. Sophie looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment the angry teenager disappeared, replaced by the child who'd trusted him with her whole heart. I still want to call you that, she whispered. Even though I'm mad at you. Even though everything's different now. Nothing's different, David said firmly. Not the important things. Not the love. Sophie nodded slowly, still clutching the tiny figure. I need to understand who I am, she said. Who I was before you found me. But I don't want to lose who I became after. You won't, David promised. We'll figure it out together. All of it. As Sophie carefully gathered the pieces of the broken snow globe, David understood that this was their shatter point. The moment when the perfect, protected world of childhood cracked open to reveal the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of love that had to be chosen every day. The little girl in the red coat would never dance in her perfect snow again. But maybe, if they were both brave enough, they could build something even better from the pieces. A love that was tested and chosen, unbreakable because it was real. The weeks that followed the shatter point moved like a cautious dance between two people learning new steps. Sophie retreated into herself, spending hours in the public library researching adoption laws, birth records, and anything she could find about teenage mothers in the system. David gave her space but made sure she knew he was there, leaving her favorite coffee on the kitchen counter each morning, texting gentle reminders about dinner, maintaining the small rituals that had always anchored their relationship. The adoption papers sat on the dining room table like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Sophie came home with a manila envelope that made David's blood run cold. He was in the kitchen, pretending to read the newspaper, but actually listening for the sound of her key in the lock, when she walked in and set the envelope on the counter between them. I hired a private investigator, she said without preamble. I found her. David's hands stilled on his coffee cup. Sophie. Her name is Maria Santos. She's 32 now, married with 2 kids. Sophie's voice was carefully neutral, but David could see the storm behind her eyes. She lives in Portland. She's a nurse. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 15 years of carefully avoided questions. David wanted to ask if Maria had wanted to be found, if she'd known Sophie was looking, if she'd asked about the baby she'd left in the rain. But he knew those weren't his questions to ask. Do you want to meet her? He asked instead. Sophie's composure cracked slightly. I don't know. Maybe. I think about it constantly, but then I think about what I'd say to her. Hi, I'm the baby you threw away. How's your real family? Sophie. No, I know what you're going to say. That she was young, that she was scared, that she thought she was doing the right thing. But she has 2 kids now, Dad. 2 kids she kept. So what was wrong with me? The word dad slipped out so naturally that David wasn't sure she'd even noticed. But he noticed. He noticed and held on to it like a lifeline. There was nothing wrong with you, he said firmly. There has never been anything wrong with you. Sophie pulled out one of the dining room chairs and sat down, suddenly looking exhausted. I found her on Facebook. She posts pictures of her kids all the time. Soccer games, birthday parties, family vacations. They look happy. David could hear the longing in her voice, the part of her that wondered what it would have been like to grow up in those pictures, to be the daughter who was kept instead of the one who was left. She looks like me, Sophie continued quietly. Or I look like her. Same eyes, same smile. Her daughter, my half-sister, she's 13. She has my stubborn chin. She looked up at David with tears in her eyes. I have a sister who doesn't know I exist. David's heart broke for her, for the complexity of emotions she was navigating, for the impossible situation of wanting to belong to someone who'd already moved on, for the fear that reaching out might shatter not just her world, but Maria's as well. What do you want to do? He asked. I wrote her a letter, Sophie said, pulling another envelope from her backpack. I've rewritten it about 50 times. I don't know if I should send it. Can I read it? Sophie hesitated, then slid the letter across the table. David opened it carefully, as if it might explode in his hands. Dear Maria, you don't know me, but 15 years ago, you made a choice that changed both our lives. My name is Sophie, and I'm the baby you left at the community center on December 15th, 2008. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty or to disrupt your life. I know you were young and scared, and I know you thought you were doing what was best for me. In many ways, you were right. The man who found me has been the most wonderful father I could have asked for. He loves me completely, and I've had a good life because of the choice you made. But I need you to know that I exist. I need you to know that I'm okay. I need you to know that I don't hate you, even though I'm still trying to understand why keeping me wasn't an option when keeping your other children was. I don't know what I want from you. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe just to know that you sometimes wonder about the baby you left, and that you're glad she found someone who chose her. I look like you. I have your eyes and your smile and probably your stubbornness. I play piano, and I want to be a teacher, and I make terrible jokes that make my dad laugh anyway. I thought you might want to know that. I don't know if I'll send this letter. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever comes next. But I needed to write it. I needed to put the words somewhere. Your daughter, Sophie. David read the letter twice, his throat tight with emotion. It was honest and raw and heartbreaking in its maturity. The words of a young woman trying to build a bridge across 15 years of silence. It's beautiful, he said, handing it back to her. Whatever you decide to do with it. Sophie folded the letter carefully, running her fingers along the creases. I'm scared of what she might say. Or what she might not say. I know. I'm scared that if I contact her, it will change everything between us. That you'll think I'm choosing her over you. David reached across the table and took her hand. Sophie, love isn't a competition. You have room in your heart for complexity. You can want to know where you came from and still know where you belong. Where do I belong? The question was whispered, vulnerable. Here, David said without hesitation. With me. In this house, in this family we built together. That doesn't change because you have questions or because you want to understand your whole story. Sophie looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not the angry teenager of 3 weeks ago, but not quite the trusting child of before either. Something new, something earned. I want to send the letter, she said. But I'm terrified. Do you want me to be there when you mail it? Would you? Sophie, I would do anything for you, including letting you go if that's what you needed. But I'm hoping you'll choose to stay. Sophie squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere, Dad. Even if I get answers I don't like, even if she doesn't want to know me, even if everything gets complicated, I'm not going anywhere. The word Dad was deliberate this time, a choice rather than a slip. David felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for weeks. "And the adoption papers?" he asked carefully. Sophie looked at the manila folder on the table, then back at him. "I want to do it. I want to make it official. Not because it changes anything between us, but because I want the world to know that you chose me and I chose you back." 2 days later, they stood in the courthouse, Sophie in the blue dress she'd worn to her junior prom, David in his best suit. The judge was a kind woman in her 60s who'd clearly done this ceremony many times before, but she seemed to understand the weight of the moment. "This is unusual," she said, reviewing the papers. "Most adoptions of this type happen when the child is much younger." "We're not most people," Sophie said, and David felt his heart swell with pride at her confidence. "No, I can see that." The judge smiled. "Sophie, you understand that this is your choice? At 15, you're old enough to make this decision for yourself." "I understand. And I choose him. I choose this family." The ceremony was simple. A few questions, some signatures, the official stamp that made legal what had been true in their hearts for 15 years. But when the judge declared them father and daughter in the eyes of the law, Sophie threw her arms around David's neck and whispered, "Now it's official. You're stuck with me forever." "Forever," he agreed, holding her tight. They celebrated with ice cream at the shop where they'd gone after Sophie's first piano recital, after her first day of middle school, after every milestone that had mattered. The same booth, the same ritual, but everything changed by the simple act of choosing each other with eyes wide open. "I mailed the letter yesterday," Sophie said, halfway through her chocolate sundae. David's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified, relieved, curious, sick to my stomach." She grinned. "All at once. And if she doesn't respond, then I'll know I tried, and I'll know that the family I have is the one that chose me back." Sophie reached across the table and took his hand. "I might always wonder about her, about what could have been, but I know what is, and what is pretty amazing." That night, as David tucked the adoption decree into his safe, next to Sophie's first tooth, her kindergarten graduation certificate, and all the other treasures of their life together, he realized that the shatter point hadn't broken them. It had transformed them. They were no longer held together by the innocent trust of childhood or the unquestioned bonds of early love. They were held together by something stronger, the conscious choice to be a family, made by two people who understood exactly what they were choosing and why. The little girl in the red coat would never dance in her perfect snow globe again. But the young woman who had chosen to stay, who had chosen to make their bond legal and lasting, who had chosen to love despite the risk of being hurt, she was beautiful beyond anything any perfect world could contain. As Sophie called goodnight from her room, David smiled and called back, "Good night, sweetheart. I love you. Love you too, Dad. Forever and legally." Her laughter echoed through the house like music, and David knew that whatever came next, whether Maria responded to the letter or not, whether Sophie's search for her origins brought joy or heartbreak, they would face it together. Not as a man and the baby he'd saved, but as a father and daughter who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice meant. The snow globe was gone, but they had built something better from the pieces. A love that was tested and chosen, unbreakable because it was real. 7 years later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of Sophie's apartment, casting golden light across the chaos of wedding preparation. Dress bags hung from every doorframe, flowers covered every surface, and the coffee table was buried under a mountain of thank you cards waiting to be addressed. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her wedding dress for the 100th time, when she heard the familiar sound of David's key in the lock. Some things never changed. He still had a key to her place, still brought coffee on important mornings, still showed up exactly when she needed him most. "How's the bride?" he called out, and Sophie could hear the smile in his voice. "Terrified," she called back, which was only partially true. She was nervous about the ceremony, about tripping in her heels, about crying during her vows. But she wasn't terrified of marrying Michael. That part felt as natural as breathing. David appeared in the doorway, looking distinguished in his morning suit, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression he'd had on every milestone morning for the past 22 years, pride mixed with the bittersweet knowledge that she was growing up. "You look beautiful," he said, and his voice was slightly hoarse. "Don't you dare make me cry before we even get to the church," Sophie warned, but she was smiling as she took the coffee from him. They stood there for a moment, father and daughter, both aware that this was one of those pivotal moments that would live in their memories forever. In a few hours, Sophie would walk down the aisle on his arm, and while she would always be his daughter, she would also become someone else's wife, someone else's primary person. "I have something for you," David said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Sophie's breath caught. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant, a snow globe, perfectly crafted in miniature, with a tiny figure inside that looked remarkably like a little girl in a red coat. "I had it made," David said quietly. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you of where we came from, but also of what we built together." Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the necklace from the box. "It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect." As David fastened the clasp behind her neck, Sophie caught sight of something else in the mirror, a photograph on her dresser that hadn't been there the day before. She turned to look at it properly and felt her heart skip. It was a picture of her and Maria Santos, taken just 6 months ago during their third meeting. They were sitting on a park bench, both smiling, both holding cups of coffee. Maria's daughter, Sophie's half-sister Anna, was between them, making bunny ears behind Sophie's head. "She sent it yesterday," David said, following her gaze. "Along with this." He handed her an envelope addressed in Maria's careful handwriting. Sophie opened it, her heart pounding. "Dear Sophie, I know today is your wedding day, and I wanted you to know that I'm thinking of you. I'm so proud of the woman you've become, and I'm grateful every day that you found the courage to write to me. I know our relationship is complicated, and I know it always will be. But I want you to know that not a day has gone by since December 15th, 2008, that I haven't thought about you. Not a day that I haven't wondered if you were happy, if you were loved, if you were safe. When I left you that night, I was 17 and terrified and convinced that I was giving you a chance at a better life than I could provide. I know now that I was also giving myself a chance to grow up, to become the kind of person who could be worthy of your forgiveness. I can't change the past, and I can't be the mother who raised you. But I can be grateful that David found you, that he chose you, that he gave you all the love I was too young and scared to give. I can be grateful that you chose to find me, and that you've let me be part of your life in whatever way works for both of us. Anna is so excited to have a big sister. She's been practicing her maid of honor speech for weeks, even though she's not in the wedding. She says she wants to be ready, just in case. I hope your wedding day is everything you dreamed it would be. I hope Michael knows how lucky he is. I hope you know how proud I am to be part of your story, even if it's not the part one originally planned. With all my love, Maria. P.S. I enclosed something for you. I hope you'll understand why I kept it." Sophie looked in the envelope and found a small, worn hospital bracelet. Her hospital bracelet from the day she was born. Baby girl Santos was printed in faded blue ink. "She kept it," Sophie whispered, touching the bracelet with trembling fingers. "All these years she kept it." David wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood there in the golden morning light, looking at the photograph and the bracelet and the evidence of how complicated and beautiful love could be. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Almost." Sophie turned in his arms. "I need to tell you something first." David's expression grew serious. "What is it?" "When I was 15, when I found out about Maria, I was so angry. I felt like everything was a lie, like our whole relationship was built on pity and secrets. But I understand now that love isn't about the beginning of the story. It's about everything that comes after." She took his hands in hers. "You didn't save me that night in the rain. We saved each other. You gave me a family, and I gave you a reason to open your heart. That's not pity, Dad. That's love. That's choice. That's the most beautiful thing in the world." David's eyes filled with tears. "Sophie, I need you to know that when I walk down that aisle today, when I start my own family, it doesn't change anything between us. You're not losing a daughter. You're gaining a son-in-law who thinks you're amazing and who promises to love me the way you taught me I deserved to be loved." "How did I get so lucky?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We both got lucky," Sophie said, and then she grinned. "Besides, you're stuck with me forever, remember? It's legally binding now. They laughed, and the moment of intensity passed, replaced by the warm familiarity of a joke they'd been sharing for 7 years. An hour later, Sophie stood at the back of the church, her arm linked through David's, waiting for the music to begin. The sanctuary was full of people who had watched their story unfold, friends, colleagues, neighbors who had become family. Margaret sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Michael stood at the altar, looking nervous and excited and absolutely perfect. "Last chance to run," David murmured, and Sophie could hear the smile in his voice. "Not a chance," she replied. "I learned from the best that when you find something worth keeping, you hold on tight." The music began, and they started their walk down the aisle. Sophie could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but all she could see was Michael's face, bright with joy and love and the promise of their future together. Halfway down the aisle, she squeezed David's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Thank you," he whispered back, "for choosing me." When they reached the altar, the minister asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" David's voice was clear and strong. "I do, with all my love and blessing." But before he placed Sophie's hand in Michael's, he leaned down and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh through her tears. Later, people would ask what he'd said, but Sophie never told them. Some things were too precious to share, too perfect to explain. What he'd said was, "The little girl in the red coat would be so proud of the woman you've become." As the ceremony continued, as Sophie and Michael exchanged vows that spoke of choice and commitment and love that transcended everything that had come before, David thought about the cardboard box and the December rain and the tiny fist that had reached toward him in the darkness. He thought about first smiles and first words and first steps. He thought about piano recitals and scraped knees and teenage heartbreak. He thought about the adoption papers and the shatter point and the conscious choice to build something beautiful from the pieces. But mostly, he thought about how grateful he was to have been chosen by someone who had no reason to trust, no obligation to love, no guarantee of forever, and who had chosen him anyway, over and over again, until choice became instinct and instinct became the deepest kind of love. When the minister pronounced Sophie and Michael husband and wife, when they kissed and turned to face their future together, David stood and applauded with everyone else. But his eyes were on Sophie's face, radiant with joy, and he knew that whatever came next, grandchildren, hopefully, and holidays, and all the beautiful chaos of a family that kept growing, they would face it together. The abandoned baby and the lonely businessman had found each other in the cold and rain 22 years ago. The father and daughter who stood in this church today had chosen each other with eyes wide open, hearts full of love, and the absolute certainty that some bonds are stronger than blood, deeper than genetics, more lasting than any storm. As they walked back down the aisle together, Sophie glowing with happiness, David bursting with pride, he could almost hear the echo of a baby's cry in the December rain and his own voice, young and scared and full of wonder, whispering, "I've got you. I've got you, and I'm never letting go." He'd kept that promise. And in all the ways that mattered, so had she. The snow globe world was gone, but they had built something infinitely better, a love that was tested and chosen, complicated and real, unbreakable, because it was built on the foundation of two people who had decided, every single day, to choose each other. And that, David thought as he watched his daughter dance with her new husband, was the most beautiful story of all. If this story touched your heart, you're not alone. Sometimes the most beautiful families aren't born, they're chosen. In a world where we often focus on what's broken, stories like David and Sophie's remind us that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Have you ever experienced the transformative power of chosen family? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you believe in the power of love over blood, of choice over circumstance, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share stories of hope, healing, and the incredible resilience of the human heart every week. Because everyone deserves to know that somewhere out there, there's a love that will choose them. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of being chosen, and you have the power to choose love too. See you in the next story.